The sound of screeching tires shattered the peaceful morning quiet as a silver SUV skidded to a halt at the edge of my property. The driver's door flew open with such force that I thought it might break off its hinges. A woman with highlighted blonde hair styled in an angled bob emerged, her face contorted in rage, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head like a crown. "What do you think you're doing?" she screamed, stomping toward my newly installed fence in her pristine white sneakers. I stood on my side of the barrier, tool belt around my waist and land deed firmly in hand. "You cannot do this," she continued, her voice rising to a pitch that made birds scatter from nearby trees. "This is community property. This path has been here for 15 years. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "Good morning to you too," I said calmly. "Actually, according to the county records and my property deed, this land belongs to me. It always has." I held out the document, but she refused to even look at it, instead pulling out her phone and furiously tapping the screen. "I'm calling an emergency homeowners association meeting right now," she threatened. "I'm the president, and you clearly don't understand how things work around here. This fence comes down today, or you'll be facing daily fines." I gestured to the no trespassing sign I'd just finished securing to the fence post. "I understand perfectly how private property works, and I'd appreciate it if you'd stop trespassing on mine." The woman, who I would soon learn was Karen Mitchell, president of the Sunny Pines Homeowners Association for the past 8 years, looked at me like I had just committed an unforgivable sin. "You've made a serious mistake," she hissed before storming back to her vehicle. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." As she peeled away in her SUV, I turned back to my work, hammering the final nails into my fence with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. I knew the confrontation wasn't over. It was just beginning. I'd moved to Sunny Pines 3 months ago, attracted by the natural beauty of the area and the promise of peace and quiet after years of living in the city. The property was perfect, 5 acres backing up to a small forest with a stream running through the far corner. When I purchased it, I was aware there was a homeowners association, but my property sat on the edge of the development, and I figured I'd have minimal interaction with them. The previous owner had mentioned something about neighbors occasionally walking through the back portion of the land, but assured me it wasn't a problem and happened rarely. I should have paid more attention to the slight hesitation in his voice when he said this. Looking back, there were other warning signs too. How quickly he accepted my offer despite having other interested buyers. His eagerness to close the deal before the next homeowners association meeting, and his cryptic parting words at the closing, "Good luck with the neighbors. Some of them can be particular." My first 2 weeks in Sunny Pines were blissful. I spent my days unpacking, setting up my home office with a view of the woods, and exploring my new property. I'd fallen in love with the stream that meandered across the back acre, creating a small, secluded glade surrounded by willows. I'd already drawn up plans to build a small deck there where I could work on warm days, listening to the gentle flow of water and the songs of birds. It was during my 3rd week, on a crisp Saturday morning, that I first noticed the intrusions. I was enjoying coffee on my back porch when a jogger cut directly across my backyard, passing within 20 feet of where I sat. Before I could even process this, a couple with a golden retriever followed the same path, the dog running off leash and actually coming up to sniff at my legs before its owners called it back with a casual wave in my direction, as if this were perfectly normal. Throughout that day, I counted 17 people crossing my property, joggers, families with children, people walking dogs, even someone on a mountain bike. There seemed to be a clear path worn into the grass, leading from a gap in the trees on one side of my property to a similar opening on the other side. The trail wasn't visible from the house when I'd first viewed the property, partially hidden by a rise in the landscape and some strategic shrubbery that I now suspected had been deliberately placed to obscure it from potential buyers. That turned out to be far from the truth. Within my first week, I noticed a steady stream of joggers, dog walkers, and hikers crossing directly through what was supposed to be my private sanctuary. At first, I didn't say anything. I was new and didn't want to cause problems. But as days passed, the traffic increased. People would let their dogs run off-leash, and I found litter scattered along what was clearly being treated as a public trail. When I consulted my property maps again, I confirmed what I already knew. The entire area was my private property, with no easements or rights-of-way listed. The previous owner had simply allowed the trespassing to continue, probably to avoid confrontation with neighbors who had grown accustomed to using the shortcut. The trail connected the main subdivision to a popular community park about half a mile away, saving residents a 15-minute detour around my property. I spent the next day observing the pattern of traffic from a distance, noting peak times and taking photographs. The steady stream of trespassers continued from dawn until dusk, with some people even using flashlights to navigate the path after dark. What bothered me most wasn't just the invasion of privacy, though that was considerable, but the complete disregard for my property. Dog owners allowed their pets to relieve themselves on my land without cleaning up. Children veered off the path to pick wildflowers I'd been carefully cultivating. One group even stopped midway to have a picnic, leaving behind wrappers and an empty soda can. That evening, I called my real estate agent to ask if she'd been aware of this situation. Her uncomfortable silence told me everything I needed to know before she finally admitted, there may have been some mention of an informal pathway in the disclosure documents. When I reviewed the paperwork, I found a single vague sentence buried in page 17 of the seller's disclosure. Neighboring residents may occasionally traverse the southern portion of the property. This deliberate understatement now seemed like a calculated attempt to minimize what was clearly a significant issue. The following day, I drove to the county records office to research the history of my property and the surrounding development. The clerk, a helpful woman named Margaret, who'd worked there for decades, assisted me in locating all relevant documents. This is actually quite common, she told me as we pored over property maps. Developers often promise buyers access to amenities like parks or lakes, then realize too late that they don't have proper easements in place. Instead of fixing it legally, they just hope no one notices or complains. I decided to approach the situation diplomatically. I posted polite signs asking people to please respect private property and find alternative routes. These were promptly removed. I then tried standing outside and gently informing passers-by that they were crossing private land. Most apologized and seemed genuinely unaware, but several dismissed me outright. "We've been using this path for years," was the common refrain. One man in particular, who I would later learn was Karen's husband, actually laughed and said, "Good luck with that, newbie." My next attempt at resolving things peacefully was to research alternative routes. I spent an entire weekend exploring the neighborhood, taking careful notes and photographs, and found that there was actually a perfectly viable path that could connect the subdivision to the park without cutting through anyone's private property. It would add perhaps 3 minutes to the walk, hardly an inconvenience. I created detailed maps showing this alternative route, and even offered to help establish it by clearing some overgrown brush along one section. I printed these maps and placed them in weatherproof sleeves attached to posts at both entrances to my property where people were crossing. Alongside them, I posted a polite note explaining that while I understood the convenience of the current path, it crossed private property, and I was proposing this alternative for everyone's benefit. I even offered to contribute financially to creating proper signage for the new route if the Homeowners Association would work with me. Within 24 hours, these too had been removed. Not just removed, I found the crumpled remains in my mailbox with a handwritten note that simply said, "Not happening." The handwriting, I would later confirm, matched Karen's signature on Homeowners Association documents. Still trying to avoid confrontation, I decided to speak directly with my immediate neighbors to explain the situation and gain some support. Most were sympathetic when faced with the actual facts. "I had no idea it was private property," said the elderly couple who lived to my east. "Karen always told us it was a designated community trail." Another neighbor admitted, "I wondered about that. When we bought our place 5 years ago, I asked about easements before we built our fence, and there was nothing on the records showing a trail through your lot." Finally, I attended an Homeowners Association meeting to address the issue formally. I introduced myself, explained the situation, and asked for the board's cooperation in communicating to residents that the trail was on private property. That was the first time I encountered Karen Mitchell face to face. She was sitting at the center of the board table, and the moment I mentioned the trail, her entire demeanor changed. "That path is a neighborhood tradition," she declared, cutting me off mid-sentence. "It's been there since the development was built. People move here specifically for access to that trail." I tried to explain that tradition didn't override property rights, but she turned to the other board members and said, "I think we're done with this topic. Next item on the agenda, please." I was effectively dismissed without resolution. As I gathered my documents to leave, I noticed several residents watching me with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed hostility. One older gentleman caught up with me in the parking lot afterward. "Word of advice," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Karen considers that trail her personal accomplishment. When she became president 8 years ago, she established it by simply telling everyone it was an official community pathway. The previous owner of your place tried to fight it for a while, but gave up after his kids started getting excluded from neighborhood activities." This information was both illuminating and disturbing. It suggested I wasn't just dealing with a misunderstanding about property boundaries, but with someone who had deliberately misrepresented the situation and now had too much pride invested to back down. The gentleman, who introduced himself as Frank, a retired attorney, added one more piece of advice. "Document everything. Karen plays hardball, and she's not above bending rules to get her way." His warning proved prescient. The day after the meeting, I received an email from the Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee, which I discovered consisted of Karen and 2 of her closest friends in the neighborhood, informing me that my property was due for an emergency compliance inspection the following morning. When I asked what had precipitated this sudden need for inspection, the reply simply stated, "Multiple reported violations requiring immediate attention." The following week, I received a notice of violation from the Homeowners Association for improper landscape maintenance and unauthorized signage, referring to my polite requests for people to stay off my property. The daily foot traffic continued, and now people seemed even more determined to use the path, often making direct eye contact with me while trespassing, as if daring me to do something about it. That was when I decided more decisive action was necessary. I consulted a lawyer who confirmed that I had every right to fence my property. I also hired a surveyor to mark the exact boundary lines, ensuring there would be no question about where my land began and ended. With legal confirmation in hand, I ordered materials and began construction of a sturdy, 6-foot privacy fence across the portion of my property where the unauthorized trail ran. I worked through the weekend, and by Sunday evening the fence was complete. A solid cedar barrier with clear private property and no trespassing signs posted every 20 feet. I installed a locked gate for my own access to the back portion of my land, and for the first time since moving in, I felt like my property was truly mine. The peace lasted exactly one night. Monday morning brought Karen's screeching tires and her furious confrontation. And true to her word, by that afternoon, I received an email notifying me of an emergency Homeowners Association meeting scheduled for the following evening to discuss my unapproved structure and obstruction of community access. I spent that night researching Homeowners Association bylaws and preparing my defense. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and nearly half the neighborhood showed up, a much larger attendance than the regular meeting I'd attended previously. Karen sat at the front, flanked by the other board members, all looking somber, as if preparing for a funeral rather than a discussion about a fence. I arrived early and was surprised to find myself approached by a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Linda, a 10-year resident of the community. "I just wanted you to know that not everyone is against you," she whispered. "Some of us have been waiting for someone to stand up to Karen for years." Before I could respond, she quickly moved away as Karen entered the room, her heels clicking authoritatively on the hardwood floor. The meeting room filled quickly. I noticed people seemed to naturally separate into factions. Those clearly aligned with Karen sat near the front, while others who smiled tentatively at me clustered toward the back. There was a tension in the air that suggested this meeting was about more than just my fence. Karen called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel, unnecessarily formal for a neighborhood gathering. She wore a blazer that looked straight out of a corporate boardroom, and had arranged the table at the front to resemble a judge's bench, with her seat slightly elevated above the others. "As you all know," Karen began, her voice carrying a practiced authority, "one of our newer residents has taken it upon himself to obstruct the park access trail that our community has enjoyed for more than a decade." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "This action was taken without proper approval from the Architectural Review Committee, in direct violation of our covenants." When it was my turn to speak, I approached the front with my documents in hand. "I appreciate everyone's concern," I began, "but there seems to be some confusion about the nature of this trail. According to county records and my property deed, which I've brought copies of for the board, the land in question is privately owned, by me. There is no recorded easement or right-of-way. The previous owner may have informally allowed people to cross, but that was his choice, not a legal requirement." I distributed copies of the survey, property maps, and relevant sections of the Homeowners Association bylaws that I had highlighted. Furthermore, the Homeowners Association covenants only apply to structures visible from the street or affecting the neighborhood aesthetic. My fence is in the rear of the property, not visible from any public road, and constructed of approved materials. Karen's face flushed red as she glanced at the documents. "This is beside the point," she said dismissively. "There's such a thing as established use. That path has been there for 15 years. You can't just come in and disrupt our community like this." A man in the back raised his hand. "Actually, I'm a real estate attorney, and what he's saying is correct. Without a recorded easement, there's no legal right to cross his property, regardless of past use." Karen looked like she'd been slapped. "Well, we'll just have to see what the county has to say about that. In the meantime," she turned to me with a cold smile, "the board will be conducting a thorough review of your property for any other potential violations." As the meeting dissolved into heated discussions among various factions, I found myself approached by several residents who spoke in hushed tones. "You don't know what you're getting into," warned one woman who identified herself as a former board member who had resigned after clashing with Karen. She once had someone's prize rose bushes removed while they were on vacation, claiming they violated height restrictions. They'd been there for 10 years before she decided they were a problem. Another resident, a soft-spoken man who had lived in the community since its founding, added, "She's been ruling through fear for years. Most of us just keep our heads down and hope we don't become her next target." His wife nodded in agreement, adding, "We actually canceled plans to build a gazebo in our backyard after she hinted it might cause problems with our annual assessment." I was beginning to understand that this fence dispute was merely the visible part of a much deeper community dysfunction. Karen had apparently spent years consolidating power and using the Homeowners Association as a personal enforcement mechanism for her preferences and vendettas. What I had stumbled into was not just a property boundary issue, but a long simmering powder keg of resentment and fear. True to her word, the following week brought a flurry of violation notices. My mailbox was supposedly 2 inches too low. My front lawn exceeded the maximum allowed grass height by a fraction of an inch. The color of my back deck stain didn't precisely match the approved color chart. Each violation carried a potential fine, and each required time and resources to address or dispute. The pettiness reached almost comical levels. One notice claimed that the brass numbers on my house were causing excessive glare that created a nuisance for passing motorists, despite my house being set back from the street behind several mature oak trees. Another cited improper placement of garbage bins, even though I had carefully followed the written guidelines and placed them exactly where my neighbors did. A third claimed unauthorized vegetation, referring to a native wildflower garden I'd planted that attracted butterflies and bees, something the original Homeowners Association environmental guidelines actually encouraged. I documented each absurd claim with photographs and measurements, keeping a detailed log of the harassment. I also began noticing unmarked Homeowners Association vehicles slowly driving by my house multiple times per day, clearly looking for additional violations to report. One afternoon, I caught someone actually on my property with a measuring tape assessing the height of my hedges. When confronted, the man claimed to be from the Landscaping Compliance Committee, a committee that, as I would later discover, didn't officially exist in any homeowners association documentation. The psychological warfare extended beyond just violation notices. My invitations to neighborhood gatherings suddenly got lost. Parents would hurry their children away when I walked past them on the street. Deliveries to my home mysteriously ended up at the wrong addresses. It was as if Karen was orchestrating a community-wide freeze-out. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her campaign. I discovered she had created a post in the neighborhood Facebook group portraying me as a selfish newcomer intent on destroying community traditions. Neighbors were encouraged to express their disappointment with my actions, and many did, though few of them had ever spoken to me directly. Some comments veered into concerning territory, with suggestions to make him regret moving here and show him how we deal with problem residents. The online harassment became so intense that I had to distance myself from social media altogether. Screenshots shared with me by sympathetic neighbors showed the discussion devolving into personal attacks, with Karen actively fueling the flames by adding misleading information about me. She claimed I had a history of disputes in my previous neighborhood, entirely fabricated, suggested I was planning to subdivide my property into high-density rental units, completely false, and even implied I had connections to a developer looking to build commercial properties in the area. Absurd and untrue. The most disturbing development came when someone posted my personal cell phone number and email address in the group, along with a suggestion to let him know how we feel. I began receiving anonymous calls at all hours, most ending as soon as I answered, though some featured nothing but background noise and muffled laughter. My email inbox filled with messages ranging from disappointed pleas to restore access to the trail to explicit threats about what might happen to my property if I didn't wise up. One evening, I received a particularly unsettling call from a blocked number. The male voice on the other end simply said, "Security cameras can't watch everything all the time. Accidents happen. Fences fall down, houses catch fire. Think about it." The line went dead before I could respond. Although I couldn't prove it, the voice sounded remarkably similar to Karen's husband, whom I'd heard speaking at the Homeowners Association meeting. I reported this call to the local police, who took the information but warned me that without clear evidence of who made the call, there wasn't much they could do beyond documenting the incident. Unfortunately, we see a lot of Homeowners Association disputes get ugly, the officer told me sympathetically. Best thing you can do is keep detailed records of everything and make sure your home insurance is up to date. This situation took another turn when I arrived home one evening to find a sheriff's deputy at my door. Someone had reported unauthorized construction on my property. I showed the deputy my permits and property documents, explaining the situation. He seemed sympathetic. "Look," he said quietly, "I can't get officially involved in homeowners association disputes unless there's a clear violation of the law, but between you and me, you might want to install some security cameras. These situations can sometimes get out of hand." I took his advice, setting up motion-activated cameras covering my property boundaries and the fence area in particular. It didn't take long for them to capture activity. The very next day, my cameras recorded two people, one of whom I recognized as a board member, examining my fence and discussing where it might be accidentally damaged. That night, another recording showed someone attempting to break the lock on my gate, only stopping when my motion-activated security lights came on. The following morning, I awoke to find spray-painted graffiti on one section of the fence, "Public right of way." I documented everything, downloading and saving the security footage and photographing the vandalism from multiple angles before cleaning it off. The turning point came when county officials actually did show up to inspect the fence. Karen had indeed filed a formal complaint, claiming I had constructed the fence without proper permits and that it encroached on protected wetland areas. The officials surveyed the property, reviewed my documentation, and ultimately confirmed what I already knew. The fence was properly permitted, entirely on my land, and not affecting any protected areas. They provided me with an official letter stating their findings. What Karen hadn't anticipated was that her complaint would trigger a more thorough review of the area. One of the county inspectors, a diligent man named Richard, who had worked for the planning department for over 20 years, became curious about the history of the supposed trail and decided to dig deeper into the records. "This is interesting," he told me as we walked along my property line. "According to the original development plans from 15 years ago, there was a proposed walking path in this general area, but it was never approved or constructed because of concerns about disrupting the natural watershed." He showed me the old plans on his tablet, pointing to notes from the environmental impact assessment. The developers abandoned the idea and rerouted community paths to stay within common areas. Legally speaking, there never was an official trail here. Richard also discovered something else. The previous owners of my property had actually filed complaints about trespassing 5 years earlier, but had eventually given up after facing similar pressure from the Homeowners Association. "You're not the first person to have this problem," he said sympathetically, "but you're the first one who stood firm." Before leaving, Richard made a point of thoroughly photographing and documenting everything. Not just my fence and property lines, but also the evidence of Karen's campaign against me, including the vandalism and the stack of questionable violation notices. "Just doing my job," he said, with a significant look, making sure everything's properly documented for the county records. Armed with this official validation, I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I forwarded all my documentation, the deed, survey, security footage of vandalism attempts, photos of the graffiti, and the county's determination, to my lawyer, who drafted a cease and desist letter addressed to Karen personally and to the Homeowners Association Board as a whole. The letter outlined the pattern of harassment, the false violations, and the attempts to damage my property. It made clear that any further actions against me or my property would result in legal proceedings for harassment and potentially criminal charges for vandalism or trespassing. My lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn who specialized in property disputes, didn't mince words when we discussed strategy. "This goes beyond a typical neighbor disagreement," she said, reviewing the extensive documentation I'd compiled. "What we're seeing here is a pattern of coordinated harassment, possible defamation, and attempted intimidation. The threats, especially that phone call, could potentially be prosecuted as criminal actions." Evelyn recommended not just a cease and desist letter, but a comprehensive legal approach. "We need to make it clear that you're not backing down and that continuing this behavior will have serious consequences, financial and possibly criminal, for everyone involved." The cease and desist letter was just the beginning. We also filed formal complaints with state regulatory agencies overseeing homeowners associations, submitted documentation to the county sheriff's office regarding the threatening phone call and vandalism, and prepared paperwork for a potential civil lawsuit citing emotional distress, harassment, defamation, and conspiracy. Evelyn also helped me draft a factual, non-inflammatory letter to every household in the development, explaining the situation, clarifying my property rights, with attached documentation from county records, and expressing my desire to be a good neighbor while also having my legal rights respected. The letter included contact information for my attorney rather than my personal details, making it clear that any further harassment would go directly to legal channels. My lawyer also helped me draft a formal complaint to the state's Homeowners Association Oversight Board, detailing how the current leadership was abusing their authority for personal vendettas rather than legitimate community governance. The effects were not immediate, but they were significant. The violation notices stopped coming. The negative comments in the Facebook group were removed. For several days there was an uneasy quiet. No confrontations, but also no resolution. Then my security cameras captured something unexpected. Late one evening, a different board member approached my property, looked around nervously, and slipped an envelope under my door before hurrying away. Inside was a typed note. "Not all of us agree with Karen. There's going to be a special board meeting Thursday. You should come." The special meeting turned out to be about financial discrepancies discovered in the Homeowners Association account. An independent audit had revealed that under Karen's leadership, certain expenses had been approved without proper documentation, and some funds allocated for community improvements had been redirected to projects that primarily benefited properties owned by board members and their friends, including landscaping work on Karen's own backyard that had been billed as common area maintenance. The meeting room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The tension was palpable, as the financial advisor hired to conduct the audit presented his findings with clinical precision. Detailed spreadsheets were projected onto a screen, showing years of questionable transactions highlighted in alarming red. "As you can see," the auditor explained, pointing to a particularly egregious example, "this $20,000 expenditure for pathway maintenance was actually used to install a custom patio and outdoor kitchen behind the president's residence." A collective gasp went through the room. Similarly, this $15,000 allocation for security upgrades appears to have funded private security cameras and systems for 3 board members' homes, with no installations in any common areas. The most damning revelation came when the auditor displayed the Community Reserve Fund balance, the account meant to cover major repairs and emergencies, which had mysteriously shrunk by nearly 60% over Karen's tenure, with much of the money traced to a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law. Karen sat rigid in her chair, her usual confidence replaced by a tight-lipped silence as the evidence mounted. Her few remaining allies on the board gradually edged their chairs away from hers, physical distance reflecting their growing desire to dissociate themselves from the unfolding scandal. I sat quietly at the back of the room, watching as years of mismanagement came to light. Several longtime residents stood up to share concerns they'd had for years, but had been afraid to voice. One elderly woman tearfully described how Karen had threatened her with daily fines because her husband, who was undergoing chemotherapy, hadn't been able to keep up with yard work. Karen's face grew increasingly pale as the meeting progressed. When accusations turned directly to her, she attempted to deflect, blaming the treasurer and other board members. But the documentation was clear, and her allies quickly distanced themselves. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the current president," someone called out, and the motion was quickly seconded. The community bylaws allowed for immediate removal of board members with a 2/3 majority vote in cases of misconduct, and the vote wasn't even close. Karen was out. As she gathered her things to leave, her face a mask of barely contained fury, she pointed at me. "This is all because of him," she said, her voice shaking. And it wasn't just his tone, though. The trail issue just finally gave someone the courage to stand up to you. An older gentleman who had been identified as one of the original developers of the neighborhood stood up. "No, Karen, this is because for years you've confused this community with your own personal kingdom. The trail issue just finally gave someone the courage to stand up to you." In the weeks that followed, a remarkable transformation took place in the neighborhood. With the newly elected board, the Homeowners Association began functioning as it was intended, facilitating community needs rather than policing minor infractions. All the violation notices against me were formally withdrawn, and I received a written apology from the new board president. The transition wasn't entirely smooth. Years of Karen's leadership had created deep divisions and ingrained habits that took time to change. The first few meetings under the new board were sometimes chaotic, with residents unused to having their voices truly heard and considered. Old grievances surfaced, and heated debates erupted over priorities and resources. But, unlike before, these disagreements were handled with respect and transparency, with decisions made through proper votes rather than unilateral declarations. The new board president, a retired school administrator named Thomas, introduced a revolutionary concept to the Homeowners Association: listening. He established open forum sessions before each meeting where residents could speak freely about their concerns, without fear of retribution. He also insisted on complete financial transparency, with all expenditures clearly documented and accessible to any homeowner who wished to review them. Perhaps most significantly, the punitive approach to rule enforcement was replaced with a more collaborative one. Instead of immediately issuing violation notices and threats of fines, the new process began with friendly reminders and offers of assistance. When an elderly resident struggled to maintain his lawn after his wife's hospitalization, neighbors organized a weekend work party to help rather than penalizing him. When a young family couldn't afford to repaint their fading shutters, the Homeowners Association connected them with a community program that provided materials and volunteer labor. The park access issue that had sparked the entire conflict was addressed through proper channels. A community planning committee was formed to assess neighborhood connectivity needs and propose solutions that respected property rights while improving access to common areas. They consulted with urban planners and conducted resident surveys to ensure all perspectives were considered. More surprisingly, several neighbors reached out individually, some bringing baked goods or bottles of wine as peace offerings. Many admitted they had never questioned the claim that the trail was community property, because Karen had been so insistent about it for so long. Some even confessed they'd been afraid to oppose her because of her history of targeting those who challenged her authority. One Saturday morning, about a month after the special meeting, I was working in my front garden when a group of neighbors approached. They weren't carrying pitchforks or protest signs, but tools and saplings. "We had an idea," one of them explained. "Since the old trail is closed and we all understand why it needed to be, we thought maybe we could create a new one along the proper boundary line. With your permission for the section that borders your property, the Homeowners Association has approved funds to install proper signage and maintenance." I was taken aback by the gesture. They weren't demanding access or claiming entitlement. They were asking permission and offering to do things the right way. We spent the morning walking the property line, discussing options for a path that would respect my privacy while still providing convenient park access for the community. As we worked out the details, one of my former most vocal critics approached me privately. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've lived here for 12 years, and I just assumed Karen knew what she was talking about with the trail. I never bothered to check the facts." "It's water under the bridge," I assured him. He shook his head. "No, it's more than that. You standing your ground didn't just resolve a property dispute, it exposed problems that had been festering here for years. This place feels like a community again, not a dictatorship." A week later, a real estate sign appeared in front of Karen's house. The rumor was that she'd decided the neighborhood had gone downhill and was moving to an even more exclusive development across town. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction, though I kept that to myself. The new trail opened 2 weeks later, properly marked and maintained, running along the edge of my property rather than through it. To everyone's surprise, I volunteered to help with the landscaping work, planting native flowering shrubs along sections of the path. One evening, as sunset approached, I was adding mulch around the new plantings when a family walked by on the trail, parents with 2 young children and a golden retriever on a leash. They stopped when they saw me. "You're the fence guy, right?" the father asked, but there was no hostility in his voice. I nodded, brushing dirt from my hands. "The kids wanted me to tell you they like the new path better," he said. "They've been counting butterflies on these flowers you planted." The mother smiled. "We moved in just after you did, so we didn't know about all the drama until it was over, but everyone says things are much better now." I looked at my property, truly mine now, peaceful and private, yet still harmoniously connected to the community through proper boundaries and mutual respect. "Sometimes," I said, watching the children point excitedly at a swallowtail butterfly landing on one of the flowers, "good fences really do make good neighbors." As they continued their walk, I gathered my gardening tools and headed back to my house. The evening was quiet except for birdsong and the distant laughter of the children as they continued down the path. I glanced back at where my fence stood, solid and uncompromised, doing exactly what it was meant to do, not dividing but defining. Establishing boundaries had been difficult and at times painful, but ultimately necessary for genuine respect to grow. In standing up for my property rights, I had inadvertently helped the entire community rediscover something it had lost: the understanding that true community doesn't come from forced access or arbitrary rules, but from mutual respect and proper boundaries. Some things, it turns out, need to be firmly established before real connections can flourish.